This event, as you know, is being put on by the Civil Discourse Committee, which is part of the League of Women Voters of Sunnyvale and Cupertino. And I want to thank you all very much for joining us in this discussion on this very important topic, the topic of the challenge of policing and ensuring fair treatment of our communities. Now, most of us do enjoy living in neighborhoods that are relatively safe and free of crime, and we are grateful to our public safety organizations for the service that they provide. But at the same time, we really can't ignore the fact that in many communities in our nation, including in our own, things sometimes go awry, and interaction between police and citizens can result in injury or, unfortunately, even in death. Now, the reasons for these outcomes, as we know, are very complex, and there are many factors that we need to understand. Some of the reasons, they lie in our larger society. We have unacceptable levels of poverty and homelessness. They certainly do not add or foster a safe and crime-free environment. We have vastly more guns in our communities than other developed nations, and this implies that police officers must always be on high alert in case a person who they're interviewing has a weapon. There's also still a culture of racism within our communities, and our police forces are not immune. We have inadequate facilities to serve people with mental illnesses or drug addictions, and we expect our police forces to work with these clients. But many of them can behave in very unpredictable ways, and this makes police interaction much more difficult. Some of the reasons for poor public safety outcomes lie within our local governments, and even within our public safety agencies. And in trying to understand these issues, we need to try walking in the shoes of different stakeholders, including different demographic groups in our communities. So I'm absolutely delighted that we have 4 panelists to help us in our journey of understanding. They have spent a lot of time on these issues, they understand the points of view of different stakeholders, and they are so very willing to share their insights with us. So let me welcome, in order of their speaking, Shivaun Nurre, who is the Independent Police Auditor of the City of San Jose, Phan, who is the Chief of the Department of Public Safety in Sunnyvale, Manuel Herrera, who is the President of the Board of Trustees in the Eastside Union High School District, and Raveche, who's a volunteer with the League of Women Voters, and she's our Policy Director for Criminal Justice. So, in our agenda today, we want to hear each of our panelists speak for about 5 to 7 minutes. They will talk about their background and share some insights on the topics I've outlined. We will then have about 20 minutes of moderator questions to the panelists, and that will be followed by audience questions. We've collected the questions that people have sent in prior to the event, and we'll include as many questions as possible. So if you have a question now, please write it in the chat, and my co-moderators will combine similar questions and pose them to the panelists. And now it's time to hear from our panelists. And Shivaun, could I ask you to get the ball rolling, please?
Now I'm on mute. Okay.
There we are. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for having me. My name is Shivaun Nurre. I'm currently the Independent Police Auditor for the City of San Jose. So my background is from an oversight perspective. When I talk about oversight, this is a term used to talk about those people in our various communities that review police conduct, primarily police misconduct. So in San Jose, there was a push to have some other entity look at police misconduct other than the regular model of internal affairs. There was some feeling among the community that the police weren't doing a good job policing themselves. So in 1993, there was a kind of a discussion among members of our community who wanted to have civilians play that oversight role or keeping it within internal affairs. And it ended in a compromise of an auditor model, which means I don't currently investigate, but I do look at the investigations done by internal affairs to make sure they're complete, thorough, and objective. And I've been doing this for about 15 years now. To be candid with you, when I first started, I thought internal affairs was a pretty good model, the auditor model, and having internal affairs do the investigations and our office review them. I've changed along the way. I think it would be better to have some other type of entity doing the internal affairs investigations, because I don't think they're setting up those investigators for success. Currently, they rotate out every 2 years, and I think it takes at least 1 year to become a good IA investigator, and then it takes another year to really hone your skills. But in our current model, the officer then leaves and another person rotates in and has to take the place. So I would like to see more consistency and a higher level of professionalism in those investigators. You know, my office, I took this position not thinking it would be as political as it is. I kind of walk a tightrope among various groups. The social groups, definitely activists want me to play a bigger role and provide a lot more information than I'm able to under the law. I have a feeling that police officers think I push too hard on them and I'm being too nitpicky. The city council and manager, sometimes I think feel that way also. That I think they want oversight, but I don't think they want the, you know, the baggage that comes with it in terms of always pressing and pressing and pressing. So currently my latest annual report is going to be heard at council on Tuesday. And it was a big effort to get it through. I had a lot of pushback on recommendations. I had a lot of pushback on a whole bunch of stuff. So, you know, for oversight, I think it's very important because you need to have somebody neutral looking at things like excessive force, looking at things like courtesy and bias-based policing, because I think we come up from a different perspective than sworn officers. We're not the only model of oversight out there. You probably know that Oakland has actual civilian investigators looking at police misconduct. There are a whole bunch of other oversight models. Currently, the city of San Jose has hired a consultant to look at our current model to see, first, can the IA process be improved? And secondly, should any of the investigations currently in IA be moved out to another entity? So for example, moving them into my office would be one avenue that they're looking at various options. So that's about what I do. Again, I come from a civilian oversight perspective. So I don't get into the nitty gritty in terms of staffing levels and you know, what kind of the latest model of taser being used. It's pretty much just oversight. So I welcome questions in that arena. I also wanted to let the audience know that I have posted in the chat with the help of the technical person on the league, some various podcasts on police, mostly from an oversight perspective. These are mostly after the George Floyd murder until today. I think these podcasts are very, very good. And I also recommend looking at a website by a Georgetown professor who recently spent some time as a police trainee, and she has some really great insights. So I hope you avail yourselves of those offerings. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shivaun. I really appreciate your comments and your comments about your work especially. Phan, would you speak next, please?
Absolutely, and thank you everyone for being here on a Saturday afternoon to have a really good conversation on a very important topic. I also want to thank the League of Women Voters of Santa Clara County for having me here today also. So just a little bit about myself. I started the profession of law enforcement when I was 22 years old. That was back in 1989, and I started with the San Jose Police Department, worked there for 27 years. I rose to the rank of Deputy Chief of Police before retiring and becoming the Chief of the Department of Public Safety here in Sunnyvale in January 2017. And so, obviously two different departments. San Jose Police Department is a traditional police department, law enforcement department. Sunnyvale Department of Public Safety, we have three disciplines, and our officers are trained on all three disciplines. It's the law enforcement side, the police side, the fire discipline, and our public safety officers are also EMTs. Quite a unique model. It's a fully integrated model. It's one department. It's not three separate departments. And I'm very proud to have the opportunity, humbled to have the opportunity to lead such a great department in our country. And obviously, we'll have a more in-depth conversation about the issues that are impacting law enforcement during this panel discussion. But in just my general opinion, when I first started policing 33 years ago, it was completely different. And it has evolved within the last 4 decades. Obviously, most of us have heard the protect and serve mantra of law enforcement that we grew up with. But I think when we talk about protect and serve, it's more complicated, more complex nowadays than what it was maybe even 10 years ago, because our officers are expected not only to deal with crime, but also to deal with societal issues. And there's lots of turbulence right now in the world. And because of that, our officers are required to be more aware of these issues. And officers are required to be more adaptable with the changing environment. And also officers are required to be in tune with the needs of the community that they serve, right? Shivaun and I, we've worked together, or we've known each other for probably like close to 20 years now. And, I have had the opportunity to work on the internal affairs peer review back in 2006, where the San Jose Police Department did a study and compared the San Jose Police Department's internal affairs process with 17 other similar agencies, because there were demands for changes also, and changes were made. So I'm interested here.
What? Yeah. Oh yeah.
Oh dear. Sorry, Chief Ngo, I can't hear you right now.
Oh, I think I just got muted by somebody when I was talking.
That should not have happened. Definitely was not intentional. I'm sorry. Would you mind repeating your last sentence, please? I think it was just a short bit.
Oh, I think I mentioned that Shivaun and I have known each other for close to 20 years, and when I was the internal affairs commander at the San Jose Police Department, the department did a peer review comparing its internal affairs process with 17 other similar agencies, and that was out of demands for changes with the internal affairs process. So I'm interested to hear more about what Shivaun will be talking about today. So looking forward to the discussion.
Great. Thank you very much, Chief Ngo. And next we have Manuel, please.
I was trying to unmute myself. Thank you to the League of Women Voters for sponsoring this important conversation, this forum. Again, my name is Manuel, and I'm known publicly with my first initial J Manuel Herrera, and I'm a longtime trustee with the East Side Union High School District in San Jose, California, which is the largest high school district in Northern California. Early in my career, I was the ombudsman for the city of San Jose, which was an office charged with investigating citizen complaints against the police. This was at the time that Joe McNamara was the chief of police. I met regularly at the time with the chief of police. I taught at the police academy. I rode patrol with police officers, and I interacted closely with aggrieved community members. Also, I grew up in the barrios of East San Jose and directly witnessed and experienced instances of what can only be described as police provocation and police abuse. In my activist 20s, when I was a very young man, I was part of what we called the Community Alert Patrol in East San Jose, which consisted of volunteers who drove around seeking to directly witness and document aggressive police behavior and instances of police brutality. You might think with all of that, that I have a leaning or a bias that some might call anti-police, but no. Where I'm going with my remarks is that I believe that I asked the question of how do we harness the idealism and goodwill that is innate in our community. And this is idealism and goodwill that is innate in our police and in our grassroots community. I'll speak in a moment about an idea of how I imagine we can bring that more to life in our communities. From my professional and personal experience, I can tell you that street dynamics are complex, but at the root is a tension between dignity and defiance. Aggressive police officers have a hair trigger response to anything they perceive as defiance and disrespect. And community members can be easily provoked by treatment that subjects them to indignities. And from there, situations can and do escalate with sometimes tragic results. So our system, our entire system for responding to complaints of police behavior is embedded in processes that are adversarial and legalistic. This approach is limited in addressing the dignity and defiance issues that I mentioned. What I experienced as an ombudsman is that in an adversarial process, there is misrepresentation and people do want to prevail. And this is on both the side of the people and the police. One example of a case that I investigated, a citizen said an officer had banged on his door and was harassing him at night, allegedly because he was involved in a dispute with another police officer who lived in the same apartment complex, all of which the officer denied. In this case, the citizen had taped the police officer, and it was an incredible tape to listen to, a classic example of an abusive, provocative police officer. In a different incident, a citizen came in emotionally charged with a convincing story of a police officer's supposed undue, excessive behavior. The officer had arrived to question two children who were allegedly not receiving the necessary care. The father opened the door but would not let the officer in. The officer nevertheless entered the house and talked to the children. In the community member's statement to us, the father acknowledged being uncooperative, but said the officer had no reason to pull a gun and aim it at him. In this case, it was the officer who had a recording of the incident. The father had stepped into the garage saying he was going to blow the officer's motherfucking head off and had returned with a tire iron. The officer at that point pulled his gun and aimed it at the father. The officer did not otherwise physically engage or abuse the father. Most cases, however, investigations bogged down due to lack of credible witnesses or neutral third parties, where it's the word of an officer versus the word of a community member. So there is, in my experience, an enduring stalemate in how our society deals with police community issues. Everything is occurring in a somewhat polarized field. The perception is that you're either primarily pro-police or primarily anti-police, defund the police, and a middle ground is not viable. But a convergence and consensus is slowly emerging what can be called a middle ground after the intense public reaction to the murder of George Floyd. So there are three parts to this emerging consensus. Part one is that an emerging consensus that police are being asked to do too much and being asked to do things for which they are not well suited or properly trained. You hear this across the spectrum. Part two of an emerging consensus is that the need for redesigning policing. And part 3 is a growing recognition that public safety goes way beyond law enforcement and extends to society's need for mental health and substance abuse treatment programs, housing for the unhoused, youth programs, jobs with a living wage, and much more. And as much as society falls short in these areas, it incubates an environment that undermines public safety. So I'm going to go to some ideas here that I want to put into the conversation about how we might expand this middle space of potential agreement and collaboration. And I call it wise elders for the people and the police. It consists of 7 elements. I'm going to wind up my comments here. It consists of 7 elements. Element number 1 is to bring together a group of respected community elders and connect them with elders who are police commanders, and cultivate a relationship between these, what I'm calling elders, because they have senior status in the community and in the organization. Element number 2 is that respected community elders are a place where community members can bring their stories, their experience, and elders receive and vet these stories for whatever legitimate aspects. Element 3 is that community elders informally provide verbal feedback to police commanders based on this anecdotal information that they're becoming aware of. There is no process here for adjudicating. There's no process for seeking any response. Simply there is a sharing of anecdotal stories between community elders and police elders. Now, element number 4 is to discern, not to adjudicate individual cases, but rather to discern patterns of police behavior. The emphasis is on patterns, and where is where is this emerging among, and how. And element number 5 is to share concerns in private in these conversations with police commanders, but give legitimate acknowledgement of the positive things police are doing in public. Sensitive information to police commanders, but positive actions acknowledged to civic and grassroots and leadership and the media. And the element 6 is to carry this anecdotal information to key civic leaders and organizations so that they become more informed and aware. And element 7 is to enlist the media in what these community elders are learning, both on the issue of police behaviors and on the area of the positive things that are happening with the police. I'm going to conclude by saying that in the aftermath of the George Floyd murder, a columnist for Time magazine, Joe Klein, said that what if we're not falling apart as a nation in the midst of this turmoil? What if we are, in fact, doing what democracies are supposed to do, gradually learning through experience how to solve our most vexing problems? And it's in that spirit that I offer my comments today. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Manuel. That was very insightful. And to conclude our panelist comments, Ashley, would you take the floor, please?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Santa Clara League, for inviting me to participate today. I actually grew up in Santa Clara County, so in Berryessa. I would have gone to Independence High School in Manuel's school district. Right. I lived in Campbell, home of the water tower, and I've slowly made my way up through California. So I've been a long-time league member, starting off in voter services, and did a white paper on barriers to voting. What I discovered was the easiest way to remove an individual's right to vote was to place them through the criminal legal system, which is what brought me to the passion of advocating for criminal justice reform. Now, when I approach this, I approach it wholeheartedly, holistically, and with the intention of interagency collaboration, which includes community stakeholders. As a league member, civil discourse is the foundation of how I am even successful in any of these engagements. And I really seek for transparency and accountability, which means I am tough on all sides. Often when I'm in a room, I know that we have a successful compromise when everybody leaves angry at me because I've pushed all sides. I helped develop the League Criminal Justice position, which if you have not reviewed it, I thoroughly recommend that you do so, because the League does not take sides. We support our officers, we support the members to have adequate training, adequate mental health, and we support our community members so that it is really a model of 21st century policing, just, equitable, unbiased, and that we can uplift and have community input into the policing reform discussions that we're currently having. My background is varied. I like to say that I've kind of fallen into this role and I've taken it and I've run. So I currently serve as a volunteer Deputy Area Director of Social Policy for the California League. In addition to that, I am a member of the Equal Justice Society Implicit Bias Network. I am a co-sponsor of the California Racial Justice Act, which was the law that eliminated and prevents the state from seeking or obtaining criminal convictions based on race, ethnicity, and national origin. I've established a district attorney oversight group in my county in Marin, and I've also collaborated directly with law enforcement agencies across the state, LA, Pasadena, San Francisco, specifically working with San Francisco Police Department on their executive sponsor working group for use of force and bias-free policing. So I'm a policymaker, not a practitioner. And my goal as a policymaker is to ensure those policies are easy for both the officers, the members, and community members to engage with. It should not be legalese. It should be clear directives so our officers know exactly how to engage with community, what that foundation framework is, and that community understands what they can do to help engage and to really create a version of public safety that includes all of us. I don't want to take up any more time because I could seriously go on for hours on what the League is doing. I'm really interested in hearing some more of the conversation, and I am very eager to engage with our panelists. So thank you for your expertise, and I will kick it back to you, Tony.
All right, thanks so much, Ashley. Really appreciate that. So we now want to exercise the privilege of being the moderators, and we want to ask the panel a few questions that the team has developed. And you, as I said earlier, please do regard it as a conversation and an opportunity to interact with each other. And actually, I'd love for you to respond to some of the points you made during your initial presentations. So our first question is going to be around the objectives of a law enforcement organization. And what I thought was so interesting about what Chief Ngo was talking about, was the integrated Sunnyvale disciplines. And then Manuel is talking about the fact that we need to, we're asking the police to do an awful lot. So, our question is, should some of the work that's currently being done by our police force, being done by other types of professionals or personnel, for example, in responding to homelessness, mental illness, drug use, or traffic violations? So who would like to go first in that?
I'm not shy. I'll take the ball. Absolutely. The answer is yes. Our officers are vastly overworked, and our model of public safety requires of them expertise that they are not currently being trained on. So mental health crisis is a very small blip in their post-training requirements. And this is not something that we want to send any of our members into the community when they do not know how to engage with an individual. They do the best with what they have as far as their training and their equipment. I like to say that the most important piece of equipment is their critical mindset, how they engage with community members. And because I come from a fire service background, I love the integrated service that Phan is going to be sharing with us. What we see when fire approaches versus what we see traditionally when law enforcement approaches are completely different mindsets. And I think that deals directly with that objective, that we've really seen the shift in law enforcement objectives of being to protect lives. This is something that in policies, in narratives, in writing has only been in the last, I'll say 10 years. It's usually been to protect property and to enforce the laws or to keep individuals such as juveniles out of delinquency. And so that idea of protecting lives has been more of a fire narrative. Fire services, protection of life is number one. Number two, it's then property. And so this shift that we are seeing our law enforcement agencies go through is really been in a response to a lot of the visualizations of the police misconduct that we are seeing in this modern day age. And that outcry from public, but also the outcry from officers who are well-intentioned and who are doing their best, that are getting the short end of the stick for, actions of another, possibly in another state. And so it's really important that we hold our individuals accountable and have agencies and have oversight and have independent investigations, but we really need to look at that objective as being actually new. This is a new thing, and they are learning to work through those kinks. And that's from a rank and file, from the top, the leadership of the chief, down to the very bottom, new recruit. And it's going to take time to really sow and seed those changes in reform. So thank you.
Thanks, Ashley.
Yeah, I would agree with everything that Ashley has said. It's very complex, right? Because I think on the one hand, especially 2-3 years ago, with the national narrative of wanting law enforcement to step back in a lot of things that officers were doing, and it created a sense for law enforcement that this is something that police officers have said all these years, basically that they don't want to do everything. They're not capable of doing everything. But unfortunately, society has asked them to do everything. If it's 2 o'clock in the morning and you have a family member who has experienced a mental health crisis, they're not going to be able to call anyone other than the police, who operates 24 hours a day, to respond. And unfortunately, when police officers respond, there are some instances where, like I said, unfortunately, there's the use of force that happens. And so if you were to ask police officers if they would prefer not to go to these mental health calls, I think the majority of the officers would say absolutely, because they believe that other professionals are better to deal with people when they're in mental health crisis. But unfortunately, there's not enough investment currently or in the past to make that happen. I don't know of any county or city or state that has invested in resources in terms of staffing, in terms of programs, so that people are available, professionals are available 24 hours a day to go to these calls for service instead of having police officers to do that. So unfortunately, the reality is it still falls on law enforcement to handle these incidents when people are in crisis. One of the things that law enforcement, especially in the state of California, that we have done so well as compared to other agencies across the country, is that we recognize this probably like 20 years ago when we started training our officers on crisis intervention training. I'm going to say this, it's a start, it's a good start, right? Because officers receive CIT training, the basic CIT training when they go through a police academy. And depending on the agency, officers can receive additional 40-hour CIT training. Not all agencies have the capacity to do this. I mean, if you're a small agency, you don't have a big enough budget, you can't do it. And if you're a large agency, you have way too many officers to send through CIT. For my agency, I've made it a goal to have all of the public safety officers train on CIT, the enhanced training, the 40-hour training program. And even with that commitment, currently we have about 80 officers who have received that enhanced CIT training. And my agency has approximately 200 officers. And so as you can see, that's the challenge, right, of getting officers to at least receive the additional training to deal with these calls for service. I also agree with Ashley. It starts at the top. It starts with the leadership at the top, because you can have strong policies in place, but if there's no adherence and if the culture is not one where there is a respect for dignity, sanctity of life, then bad things happen. It starts at the top, the leadership of the chief, command staff, and also making sure that when we hire officers, when we train our officers, that's the emphasis that we push on our officers, that we provide people with dignity and respect when we come in contact with them, no matter what, whether it's somebody committing a crime or whether it's somebody who's experiencing a crisis, we're there to help. And that's a philosophy that each law enforcement department has to have in order for us to reduce some of the negative incidents that we have seen across the country.
Yeah, thanks very much. Anybody else like to add to the comments from Ashley and Chief Ngo?
I agree. They're both very good comments, very good perspective. I agree with Chief Ngo that the problem we currently have is I think officers would like to step away, but until we figure out and put something in place, there's no movement away. So until we have, you know, an entity that goes out and does enforcement in the homeless camps, the police have to do it. You can't just say police don't do it and then wait for a good two years to figure out what to put in its place. So there's a sequencing, and people are looking at sequencing in the wrong way. They're looking at police stepping away. That's the second step. The first step is what are you going to put in?
Yeah.
And I just sent a link about Berkeley. They're trying to move their traffic stops out of the police department. The problem they're encountering is there's no state law that allows civilians to take such actions. So again, it's another step that you have to conquer to create that entity first so the police can step away.
Good. Thank you, Shivaun. Okay, Manuel, did you want to add anything to that? Are we a pretty comprehensive discussion?
I'm not going to add anything to it. Those were
Okay.
awesome comments. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Well, so our second question would be about hiring police officers. What should the criteria be when we're hiring new police officers? What are the physical, the mental, the educational, the psychological criteria? And how do we screen police officers? Who would like to go first on that?
Well, if I could go on that.
Please.
Currently, the state of California, through POST, which is a regulatory agency, there are stringent requirements on hiring standards here in the state of California for peace officers. And recently, with recent law changes, the standards have become even more stringent in terms of looking for to screen out candidates that may have biases. And I think that is a good thing. And changes in age requirement, education requirement. I think those changes are really good changes. And I think as a whole, those standards, those standardized standards that the state has are really good standards to screen people out. But I believe that is just one piece of making sure that we have really good public safety officers, good police officers who will practice constitutional policing, that will have empathy, that is here to serve the public and understand that we're problem solvers. So for me, those standards are great, but the training is also crucial. Right? The training that starts in the police academy, what are we training officers on? And then once they graduate from the police academy, the field training program by the law enforcement agencies, do we have really good role models at field training officers that are training these very young, impressionable officers that are just starting out in their career, right? So that is really important also. It's the recruiting process, the hiring process, the standards that we set for when we hire people, but also the training that we provide to them. And then also it's policies. Do we have really good policies in place, right? And that's important also. And the last piece, I think this is the often neglected piece, is that are we open to listening to people when they have questions or suggestions and ideas? Because I think that is something, I think what Manuel sort of like alluded to earlier today, is that, you know, it seems like it's a binary choice that people are being forced into, as opposed to, no, there's got to be something in the middle. You know, there's got to be conversations between people when things go right and when things don't go right. And so some of the things that we have done here at Sunnyvale Department of Public Safety, even before the call for police reforms, is that we post our internal affairs statistics online. And internal affairs basically is a process where a law enforcement agency investigates misconduct complaints of its officers, right? So we post that information there, how many complaints we get a year, what types of complaints we get, and the dispositions of the complaints. So there's really transparency there. Do we hold our officers accountable when there are complaints from members of the public? We post the internal affairs policy manual so that people clearly can understand the process, right? Because the process not only has to be fair to the officers, but the process has to be fair to members of the public that are filing these complaints. So we want to be very transparent. You know, when people want to file a complaint, we'll walk them through the process. So it has to be a fair process. There's got to be legitimacy with what we do to earn the trust of our community members in order for us to be effective, because we can come up with all these great ideas, great policies about public safety, but if we don't have the trust and support of the community that we serve, we're not going to be very successful, right? And so that's what we do. We also post how many officer-involved shootings that our public safety officers have been involved in for the last decade. That information is there for anybody to see. Our policy manual is posted online for anyone to see. And you know, during the George Floyd police reform movement 2 years ago, we hosted a series of meetings with our community members and had discussions about public safety, racial profiling, excessive use of force, and we listened to our community members on things that we can do better or things that we can make changes on. And I think that's really crucial, right? Because we know that we can only be effective when we have the support and the trust of our community, and that means we have to work together. You know, we just can't dictate what we do all the time. It doesn't work that way.
Great, thank you very much. Any other comments on this topic? Hiring police officers. Otherwise, let's go to question number 3. And that is, relative to other OECD countries, we have a unique armed environment, and our police force are confronted with the possibility that any citizen encounter could involve the use of guns. How does this affect the emotional and physical responses of police officers, and how can we mitigate the negative effects? Complex question.
Well, from my perspective, and again, I only look in the realm of when people file complaints, but I'm under the impression that police officers are inclined to increase their use of force display or tactics because of the prevalence of guns in America. Police are very quick to, do a pat search for weapons, even if there's no bulge in the clothing. If you're wearing baggy clothing, you're probably going to get pat searched for weapons. I think it's a big problem. I think it's a big correlation between police and use of force. But I also think that one thing that the officers have been trained in is that every encounter may be your last. And that is true, but it's less true for police than other professions. So policing in America is not the most dangerous profession if you look at lives lost in the course of employment. But officers again taught to be, to be constantly vigilant and to constantly anticipate that the other person is armed. And unfortunately, with the amount of guns in America, that's a logical conclusion.
Thanks, Shivaun.
I think part of the overall problem with that perspective as well is that what we see is that reinforces racial bias. We see that individuals who have a pat search or a Terry stop tend to be a person of color, whereas when they do the search, they're not as likely to find contraband as they would if they had searched a white person. We see this reported in the RIPA data, which is the Racial Identity Profiling Act, that is collected from the Department of Justice and reported out. I know Santa Clara County just started, because you have some smaller agencies, to collect and mandate that report. And we're going to see some reports trickling out next January. But we see those kind of fear of, I will be harmed if I don't do a pat search on a person of color. It reinforces the stereotypical bias. It divides the community. It reinforces that crisis of trust that we're seeing between officers not feeling safe in specific neighborhoods and community members feeling over policed. And so I think that the prevalence of guns and the accessibility of guns is one factor that we don't talk about enough, how it correlates to policing. But I think there's an opportunity for communities and officers to advocate for the removal of situations like ghost guns. We are seeing some reforms come through the legislature in California. A ghost gun is an unregistered part, which then can be assembled later. And the majority of crimes, violent crimes in California, are with a ghost gun. And they are now being tracked with some background checks, but there's more to be done to help support both our community members for removal of the automatic weapons, but also our officers who fear them.
So I have a question.
Sorry. I think Chief, go. I think you were going to say something.
I mean, if Shivaun wants to go first, I'll defer to her.
Okay, Shivaun, go ahead.
One thing that surprises me, Chief Nurre, and maybe you could comment on this, is I don't see a lot of like national or statewide law enforcement agencies advocating for more restrictions on semi-automatic weapons or other types of guns. It's kind of a voice that you don't hear. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, I'll comment on that. I mean, you're absolutely right on that point, and I don't know the reasons why, but I know that regarding like ghost guns, illegal guns, there's been really strong advocacy for laws to address that particular issue, and we have seen a huge spike in a number of ghost guns that are out there nationally and here in Santa Clara County also. And I'm very happy to see that there have been some recent state laws that have addressed, the prevalence of ghost guns in our community. And that is the number one concern when you talk about officer safety concern of our law enforcement personnel. I'm going to go back to the points that you made, Shivaun, about, there's a tendency to overreact by officers when there's a prevalence of guns, pat searching and all that stuff. I can tell you this, in my experience, at least for the Sunnyvale Department of Public Safety, is that there's actually been a trend of de-escalation because just like other cities here in Santa Clara County, officers have confiscated many ghost guns over the last couple of years, but I've seen so many instances in the past that would probably, turn into like an officer-involved shooting. to be honest. But, you know, I'm very proud of the fact that our officers, even with the number of ghost guns that they have recovered on car stops and pedestrian stops out there, there has been no significant increase, even in the regular use of force, either going hands-on or baton or taser. So I think our officers are really doing a great job de-escalation. I think this is consistent with what I'm seeing throughout the state of California, because like I said, you know, I think law enforcement agencies in California are more progressive than most other agencies throughout the country. It's just because of our training standards, the culture, and just Californians as a whole, the expectations, right? So I think de-escalation is key. Emphasizing de-escalation in your law enforcement agency is key in reducing, you know, the chances of those encounters where they could turn deadly. I think the second thing that the city of Sunnyvale is doing is that we have made it a city priority, and this is something that we have been working on for the last year or so, on equity, access, inclusion, diversity, belonging, and justice, right? Because we believe that these issues are important for our city employees to understand and recognize. And this is a top priority for our city. All of our city employees will receive training, mandatory training on these particular issues. And we have contracted out with a firm that has experience in implementing this sort of like, and I don't want to say a program or a project, because I think this is a philosophy. This is the way of Sunnyvale, where we really have, you know, an interest on these particular issues, not only in law enforcement, but everything that we do, which I think is great. So I think that's what cities should be doing. I think that's what law enforcement agencies should be doing, is looking at not only having policies out there, but pushing for that culture of de-escalation. And then for city, you know, to really look at how is it dealing with equity, access, and inclusion, and diversity, and belonging, and justice, right? In the work that we do, it's serving our community. I think that's sort of like a broad approach, as opposed to a very narrowly defined approach and just addressing such a large, complex, you know, problem that we're dealing with in our country.
Let me add a comment here that
Please,
I've been hearing comments along the way about over policing, and then comments also about standards and policies and culture and all, and yet incidents continue to be a reality of over policing, and I will share, without getting into the full story, so what is it that you need to not be doing for a police officer to not engage with you? I was sitting in a car meditating at a strip mall when there was a tap on my window and an order to roll down the window. I was asked, "What are you doing?" And I said, "I'm meditating." "Get out of the car," is what I was told. And then I was put through the PAT search and through, you know, at no time did that officer treat me with any kind of respect or courtesy, barely made eye contact. I just stood there at one point without thinking. I put my hands in my pocket and, you know, a forceful command, "Get your hands out of your pocket," which I understand. I just wasn't, you know, and at that point I actually became fearful that this officer, I don't know what's going on, but this officer is going to provoke something here. And you know, there's a lot more to this story, but I got to tell you, over policing, I call it a virus in police culture that defies every attempt at training, at filing complaints by community members and what have you. They know exactly where the line is and where the gray area is, the ones that are predisposed to exercise their authority, to engage and even provoke. If you and the complaint system is really not working to address behaviors that are not criminal behaviors. The officer who put me through the paces was not breaking any laws, and the benefit of the doubt is given to an officer who may recast the whole encounter in a whole different light, you know, in a complaint process. And you're confronted, a community member who complains is confronted with the confidentiality of personnel matters, confronted by the officer's Bill of Rights, by any number of procedural things that cut someone off from any satisfaction, not even an explanation from the officer what was going on, and that's why I'm looking to add something that isn't yet in the whole ecosystem of police community relations, and that is to work with the idealism and goodwill of especially commanders, police commanders in the field who are in conversations with elders in the community who are accumulating anecdotal information. This is soft information. This is not being routed through the adversarial legalistic complaint process where commanders can't trust what comes out of there when an officer is contradicting it, but if respected elders who are vetting stories and weeding out things that shouldn't be carried forward are sharing anecdotal information with police commanders. Today, I could call a police commander and say, I'd like to talk with you. I want to meet with you and present that I'm a respected member of the community. And the chances are nearly 100%, if not 100%, that they would agree to talk with me, and so I want to just open up a different area of communication. At no point would this process involve adjudicating a case against a police officer, but it would accumulate over time anecdotal information that says we basically have these 5 or 6 officers in the force that are generating most of the anecdotal information, and that's data for the police commanders to work with. They can they make their own assessments. They're sophisticated, about police work, and they can make a judgment call privately, confidentially. Nothing's being filed. There's no response required by the police, by elders who are sharing the anecdotal information. Don't need to get back to the community elder and report anything. We're just giving you soft information. And if we were to follow this type of new process on the field, I believe it would increase the leverage and especially catch the folks who are predisposed to heavy-handedness. I don't know if you've all been watching the news stories of the San Rafael Police Department and how they accosted a gardener and how they filed a report that made it look like the gardener was the aggressor. And yet the body cams that were now publicly released show clearly that the officers were over-policing. I won't get into that because I'm taking up too much time, but folks, we've got to do something different than what we're currently doing. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Manuel. Anyone want to respond to Manuel?
Yeah, I just want to say, I mean, I'm listening to what you're saying, and I really can't disagree with you on anything at all, because I do believe at times there are like over policing. But I also want to share it too. Just recently we had a similar incident where a police officer or one of our public safety officers was in this neighborhood, and he was flagged down by a resident that said that there was a man sitting in his truck. He looks like he doesn't belong in the neighborhood, and he wanted the police officer to make contact with that individual. And our public safety officer said no, and said because the person wasn't committing a crime, there's no valid reason, to make contact with that individual, so he didn't do it. And lo and behold, that resident sent me an email and complained, and said that that the officer should have done something, and I responded to him. And so I just want to reassure you that we do have officers out there that do practice constitutional policing. They don't over police. But at times, unfortunately, like your situation, there's over policing, and it's sort of like casts sort of like this sort of like image, of police officers always doing it. And I think we need to kind of work together, to kind of figure out, how do we promote, the things that our officers are doing right, and hold the officers accountable when they're not doing things right, not necessarily through the disciplining process, like you said. Let's not make everything an internal affairs complaint, but it's like raising awareness, right? Getting the officers to understand and buy in into what the community's needs are, and I think that's important.
I believe most officers by far fit the model of what you just described as the officer doing constitutional policing. But our challenge is with that minority that are in the system and are sophisticated about how to not be caught in the legalistic processes and so on. I'll just leave it. This virus that I talk about, and that's my word for it. It is a virus. It's an attitude on the part of some police officers that they will teach someone with an attitude what it is to disrespect an officer or to hesitate in complying. Out come the tasers, the batons, escalating force, a brutal training that they will submit instantly to police authority. Anyone with any kind of a sense of these officers come almost looking for that. And then, they know exactly what to do to escalate the situation and then file a report and totally be on the side of policing for the good of the community, on the law, on the side of the law. I'm channeling really frustration that is in the neighborhoods that I grew up in, because I personally, I'm not as excited about all this as I'm expressing now, but I know what is in my community and the frustration that no matter what we do, this doesn't stop,
I'd like to comment on Mr. Herrera's comments, because a couple things come to mind. A lot of time we talk about policing and concerns about policing. It has to do with force, injury, and death. But there are so many other ways that police officers can impact people's lives. So for example, and I think Mr. Herrera will agree, officers making arrests for a 148 failure to obey with the lawful officer's command. So if they don't think you're complying fast enough, they could file charges on that. Now, unlikely a DA is going to file and move forward with a prosecution, but you still have an arrest record that's going to stay with you unless you have enough knowledge or monetary means to take care of that another way. So that concerns me that it's not just force that we should be worried about. It's the impact of arrest records on people's lives.
It's not even mostly force, even though force occurs. It is a way of interacting that is heavy-handed, that is a sophisticated use of, it could be as much as it's something like a whole, like 5 police cars with lights flashing, showing up for something that isn't even really happening. It's being created by police officers on some kind of a, not much happening at all. And then it starts to escalate. And I've seen aunts and uncles and mothers and fathers get pulled into situations that are being triggered, by a police over response or what have you. And then they find themselves being pulled for interfering with an officer, or there's just so many ways in which they can put you through the grist of everything without ever breaking the law or even policies as such, So
can I ask a question that's my ignorance of how the current Santa Clara agencies engage as far as their policy level with investigative detentions? Because what I've heard is a lot of the force or a criminal investigation or where you stop an individual, you hold them against their will in order to ask questions. But what I've seen is that gray area where an officer will stop an individual for no underlying reason, whether it's pretext, you're sitting in your car, you're meditating, or there's no underlying crime, and kind of intimidate an individual. We see this a lot, but because there is no citation, there's one, no way for the community member to reference back to that officer to file a complaint. And two, there's no record of the engagement. Now, one of the things we did in San Francisco County was that all stops, all investigative detentions where a person was not free to leave required a report, regardless if there was a citation filed. If an individual stopped and moved, a report would need to be filed. As a means of tracking, this tends to be racial profiling stop. And I'm just curious if Santa Clara does anything like that. Do they record all engagements with community members? And if not, perhaps that's something that you could advocate for.
Yeah. Well, I can't speak behalf of all the law enforcement agencies in Santa Clara County, but I can tell you for Sunnyvale Department of Public Safety, every time an officer makes contact with somebody, with a car stop or a pedestrian stop, that officer is required to go out in the air and put it out on the police radio, and so that's captured, right, with our CAD or computer system. And then with the Racial Identity Profiling Act, RIPA, Sunnyvale is required to report out this stats by beginning of next year. So we have started collecting the data already. And so it's our policy that anytime you stop somebody, that you are required to document all the information that's required. I think there's like 27 elements that you're supposed to record. There's a lot, but basically race, gender, and reason why. And if you search the person, you know, if you found contraband or not. So that's how it's done here at Sunnyvale Department of Public Safety. I can't say that for the other law enforcement agencies, because I think the smaller agencies, they have a little bit more time to come into compliance with RIPA. Which is the law, right? And so that's where the accountability comes in. But to answer your question, there are a couple of ways that an officer can come in contact with somebody. The first one is consensual, right? There's no reason to stop or detain this person. The officer could say, "Hey, how are you doing? You know, can I ask you some questions?" That person is free to leave. And I know that Shivaun is, you know, your work as independent police auditor at San Jose, if you put out information, educational information to members of the public on what the rights are when you're being, you know, stopped by a police officer, right? And so that's one way. The second one is if the officer has reasonable suspicion that a crime is about to occur and that person is somehow related to the crime, then that officer legally can detain that person. Obviously, if there's probable cause to arrest, then absolutely the officer has every reason to stop that person. So there are like 3 ways a person can be stopped by a police officer if they're on foot. Now, if it's in a car, it requires probable cause for a car stop, right? But those stops should be recorded, right?
So my understanding about San Jose Police is if you're stopping someone on a reasonable detention grounds, you must start your body-worn camera and you must contact dispatch to tell them where you are.
Yeah. Well, thank you for reminding me. Our public safety officers do wear body-worn cameras, and they are required to activate it anytime they come in contact with a member of the public. When it's related to law enforcement purposes.
Yeah. Hey, thank you for a good discussion on this topic. I wanted to just make a brief announcement that we've got about 20 minutes left. And if any audience members would want to ask some additional questions, please put them in the chat and we'll bring them up to our panelists. But are there any last minute comments on this discussion? Otherwise, I'll ask the next question. No, thank you for a very good discussion on this.
So I'd like to make two more.
Okay, go ahead, Shivaun.
On Mr. Herrera's comments, because I think I know he was an ombudsman, and that was years before I joined the office. And in that era, you didn't have the advantage of body-worn camera. So I believe the complaint process has greatly improved because cases that might have been he said, she said previously, we now have a better idea, especially things with courtesy and searches. we do have body worn cameras. So it is, you know, it keeps the various parties stuck to their story or their credibility is in doubt. And then
That's a good point.
And then number two, you know, and I know Chief No will remember this because I've been harping on it for years. So we used to rely on the complaint system to identify bad officers, which is a horrible approach because a lot of people who complain about officers maybe shouldn't. And then on the other hand, a lot of people who should complain don't. So it's a really bad way to identify problematic officers. So recently, SJPD, I think they're in a trial project now of using other factors to identify perhaps officers who need assistance or need counseling, such as, you know, how many uses of force did they use in a certain period? How many arrests were, you know, time card issues, a whole host of factors. This is what other agencies use to help identify officers that are trending outside the norms of their division, so they can then spotlight that officer and try to figure out what's going on. Now, that doesn't necessarily replace using the elders. That could be an add-on, but we're not as adrift as we were before.
I really appreciate that information. I think it's still frustrating for community members who don't hear back because of confidentiality, because of Officers' Bill of Rights. They still are left, you know, like with an experience that was painful and aggravating. And most of the time, there are officers who will engage in such a way as to sidestep even what you're talking about. So I'm in a way kind of keep making a case for we need to add something to the mix. There needs to be anecdotal information by trusted elders in conversations with responsible police commanders, where, as I've been saying. So
I've actually another question on the tracking, you know, which since we're just talking about that, it's from an audience member, Ellen. Does each law enforcement agency in the county have a tracking system for whether or not the body cams are always on when they're supposed to be?
Well, if Ellen wants to listen to the city council meeting on Tuesday, they will be presenting possible ways of auditing body worn camera to make sure that it's being used as it should. So they're talking about two different paths. One is a compliance audit, which looks at whether the officer turned it on or off when the officer should. And then a compliance audit, which means somebody actually looks at the film and decides, do we have an issue with how the officer is implementing the policy? The compliance audit is much more expensive than, the performance audit is much more expensive than the compliance audit. Both of those will be at council, and I will put the link in the chat.
Okay, thank you. All right, let's take the conversation in a slightly different direction. We ask our law enforcement agencies to protect and serve, and that's already a tall order. Nevertheless, we have a concern that with the availability of military hardware and military procedures, there may be a tendency towards militarization in some police forces, and that weakens the objective of protecting and serving. So what do you think? Comments? Who would like to take this one?
Well, I think society went adrift in this area, not really tuning into this militarization of the police, of moving equipment from the military to police departments. I think there's more of a case for not having militarized the local police than there is for having militarized the police. And it's something that needs to be brought into policy discussions and community forums. So that's my comment.
Thanks, Manuel.
I would agree that it needs to be brought to the community members for more open dialogue. Any time we are treating our neighborhoods like the battlefields, we've already criminalized whole communities when there is not an underlying crime. That is already counterproductive to 21st century policing. Secondly, completely undermines community trust. And what we're trying to do in these reform conversations is to return that trust of community members engaging with their officers, and vice versa, officers learning to listen and respect community members as perhaps that they have never been tested with. From my engagement of doing policing reform is that usually the collaborative unions think they know best. The suits and the attorneys in the room think they know best. The politicians think they know best. The chief thinks he or she knows best. The rank and file, of course, are the only ones that know what's going on. And everybody just is no longer listening and or respecting each other. Our officers are members of the community. And when they remember that, then there is an open door created and there's a bridge that can be built for community and officers to listen, to collaborate, to create that model that we want to see, where officers are safe, they're going home to their families, they have food on their table. Oh, forgive me. Phone is about to die.
Yeah, we can hear you.
So the purpose is that we really need to not emphasize the paramilitary aspects of law enforcement, but emphasize that community engagement. And this is something I see because I work directly with fire, and fire has really cultivated that sense of trust. They do not need a warrant to enter your home because they know that they are there to serve you, to protect your life, to keep you feeling safe. That is not a sentiment that our community members currently have with law enforcement on the day-to-day engagement. When we have an actual emergency, not a criminal behavior, but an emergency, that paradigm shifts. And I've seen that. I've seen our sheriff's department, our officers become and assume that role that community now can trust. They are the people there who are going to save their lives. If we can employ that model throughout actual law enforcement at all aspects, we will continue to shift that dynamic. And, you know, specifically the military weapons or whatever tools that we're using in our arsenal, the one that I am most uncomfortable with is surveillance. Surveillance to me is a Fourth Amendment violation. There needs to be consent for search and seizure, and surveillance has a place in operations for emergency. If you want to know that there's a fire and you tap into the Ring cameras that are on everyone's front door, that's one thing. But if there's a call for a suspect who has a specific description of a Black or brown individual, and officers engage all Ring cameras and just find a person that meets that description who's walking down the street, we are reinforcing those systemic biases. We are not creating safer environments in community. So there's a time and a place, and we don't have clear directives of how to appropriately use those tools.
Yeah, I had to interject. I wonder what ever happened to bicycle policing, because for me, the bicycle is the complete opposite to militarization. And it's a great way to engender trust between police officers and the population. And there's no barrier, there's no bit of metal or glass between an officer and the public.
Yeah. So, you know, just great points by everybody here. And I just want to say this, I've quoted this very often. So Robert Peel, who's considered to be the founder of modern policing, right? A very simple quote. He said that, you know, the people are the police are the people. And I really believe that. So my philosophy is we're not an occupying force. You know, my philosophy is our core mission in public safety is to help people better their lives, right? To solve their problems. You know, they call us because they have a problem and we're here to help them. So I totally agree. I don't want to see, you know, law enforcement to be another sort of like military force in our country. That's not our purpose. That's not our mission. Having said that, I think people have listened because the lawmakers recently passed a law, the military equipment law, that requires every city, not police department, every city in the state of California, if their public safety agency has military equipment, and the definition is very broad. what is considered to be military equipment, that city has to craft an ordinance. That city would have to approve the inventory list of military equipment that their law enforcement agency is using. Oh, by the way, annually, they have to report out when they're being used, what they're being used for. I think that's transparency. I think that's what we're talking about, because I think that's important, because there has to be a balance, right? Because there are times when maybe a piece of military equipment is needed, like a Bearcat. You know, people look at a Bearcat, they think of it as an offensive tank. It's not. It is actually a rescue vehicle to rescue hostages and officers in case of a situation where people are seriously hurt, like in a mass shooting or something like that. So there's good use for it. Surveillance. Totally agree with you, Ashley. In 2017, I wanted to have a drone program here in the city of Sunnyvale. And so what we did was we did outreach for our community. First and foremost, is there support? Yes, there is support. But we also made a commitment. There's going to be complete transparency. So my commitment to the Sunnyvale community is that we are going to use the drones for when we're trying to find like a missing person, like doing an aerial search, when there's a major fire, when there's a major car accident, and instead of like using multiple officers to take pictures and video the traffic collision scene, we could use a drone to do a better job. In a tactical situation, instead of like putting officers in a position where force may be used, like an officer involved shooting, perhaps a drone could scout out the incident for us so that we can avoid that situation. Those are the instances that we use our drones for, not for surveillance. Oh, by the way, every time we use it, we're going to post it within 24 hours, and it's placed on the city website for anybody to see. And that includes every time we use a drone for training, because when we have a drone flying out there near a fire station, of course, people are going to have questions, right? And we want them to know, hey, this is a training exercise, or this is an actual deployment. So I think it can be done. There's a balancing act. It doesn't have to be, you know, you can't have it or you guys have too much. I think there's got to be that conversation between the law enforcement agency and the community that is served. And there's a general consensus that yeah, we could use these equipment, but only when, oh, by the way, let us know when you use them, if it's not something that you have to maintain confidential. I think that's a good balancing act. I think it's worked for Sunnyvale. The drone program has been around since 2017. We're the first agency in the Santa Clara County that has it. And hopefully we still have the trust and support of our community members that we can still maintain it.
Great, thank you very much. So we're coming to the end of our session. I've got literally 5 minutes left, and maybe, if I may, I'll squeeze in one more question, which I think is a rather good question. It comes from Christy.
Final comment, so I hope there's time for that too.
We might run out of time. If you can keep it short, please, Manuel.
Well, I just want to say I've been emphasizing anecdotal information, elders to elders, but what is also part of this approach I'm talking about, these same community elders can be a voice for the police to spotlight positive actions and initiatives by the police, quarterly reports where we enroll the media to also convey this information, because there's always something positive going on in law enforcement and with police initiatives. In this quarterly report, in the model I'm talking about, would spotlight the example that the chief gave us a moment ago of the officer with constitutional policing. That ought to be made public, that, you know, those kinds of incidents. We ought to make public quarterly the number of police contacts that occurred vis-a-vis the number of complaints, because it sets a context for, there's mostly not, you know, a whole lot of things going on, but the things that are going on, we want to, you know, spotlight. So praising the police publicly is a part of this thing that community elders could do more powerfully than police leadership itself. Thank you. Thanks
very much, Manuel. You know, the last question really deserves a little more time. The question is, for people, do you see that officers feel less a part of the community because they cannot afford to live in the community? If so, how do you address that? I think I'll have to ask Chief Ngo, would you like to address that in literally 1 minute?
I don't think there's a clear-cut answer of yes and no. I very much understand the high cost of living here in Silicon Valley, you know, for officers. But the same token, you know, we always have to remember the mission and why is it that we got into this profession. I always remind my officers when I talk to them, is like, remember the first time that you were interviewed? Like, why do you want to be a public safety officer? And the answers are very idealistic answers. It's to help people at the end of the day.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we keep work at the center, we'll be okay. You know, the other circumstances are too complicated for us to really factor in and say one way or the other. Keep work at the center. Remember why you got into this profession. It's to help people better their lives.
I think those are wonderful closing words, Chief Ngo. Thank you very much. And yeah, no, I really appreciate all the comments you've made and the discussions. And let me ask Marianne, maybe if you can close the session for us, please. Marianne, you're still on mute?
I just want to thank everybody. I mean, this was fantastic. Your comments were thoughtful, coming from a bit of experience that you were sharing with the community. And I'm sure I know I am, and I'm sure the rest of us here are very grateful for your time and your information. I'm going to include in the chat a closing link, which is to our website, that's going to include eventually the information on upcoming events that we're going to have. And I've also included a repeat of some of the links that Shivaun has posted. And I hope that you will go to our website. We're going to have several related events coming up, including a totally participative conversation using the National Institute for Civil Discourse materials, as well as another forum similar to this. And I'd love to have you guys back.
Mm-hmm.
Was we didn't cover half the questions.
Yeah, that's right.
So don't be surprised if we contact you again. And then we'll continue this series into next year, where we will have another series of events related to this very complex and important topic. Thank you again from the League of Women Voters and from all of us here for your time, your expertise, and your experiences. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed.